Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're exploring the relationship between religion and violence. What are the circumstances in which organisations motivated by religious ideas resort to violent methods? And how can such violence best be prevented? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. The relationship between religion and violence is a subject of enduring debate. Religion is often portrayed as a force for peace and compassion, yet history is littered with instances where religious actors have been involved in conflict. So what can we say about how these tensions work out in practice? What are the conditions in which religious organisations are more likely to use violence? And are there lessons for policymakers who want to prevent violence? Well, a new article explores exactly these questions, and it finds that a mix of grand transnational forces and local factors operating in particular countries is involved. One of the co-authors of that article is Dr. Manuel Vogt, Associate Professor of International Security here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and I'm delighted that Manuel joins me now. Manuel, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, and we're talking today about religion-based violence. Would it be helpful maybe just to clarify what sorts of activity should listeners have in mind when we're focusing on that in this discussion?
Yeah, thanks so much, Alan. Thanks for having me. Well, religion-based violence could be observed in various ways and with different types of actors, right? We could look at individuals, we could even look at states. As you mentioned in your introduction, in this paper, we're looking at non-state organizations that may use violence or not, and that might have religious agendas or not. In this paper, what we really do is we look at the use of violence by non-state organizations against state governments, and we look at the relationship between these organizations' political agendas, which might contain religious ideas or not, and their likelihood of engaging in violence against state governments.
So when we're thinking about violence as being related in some way to religion, we're thinking about the organization that is behind the violence and the degree to which its agenda is religion-related.
Exactly right. And it's always very difficult to identify, the causal role of religion in the violence that is perpetrated or not. And so ultimately, what we all do is we look at some sort of a correlation between the ideas or agendas that organizations embrace and the behavior they engage in. And when I use the term organizations, I'm referring to a rather kind of broad set of entities. These are non-state entities that are therefore outside the state apparatus. They have a name, they recruit members, and they make some political claims. So that's a rather broad definition of non-state organizations. And having or adopting this broad definition then allows us to look at very different organizations that can make very different kind of political demands or embrace very different political ideas and that engage in violence or not. Now, when we think of examples of such political organizations that have embraced religious ideas and then subsequently engaged in political violence, right, we could perhaps think of militant insurgent organizations such as Hamas in Israel/Palestine, the East Turkestan Islamic Party in China, some Caucasian organizations in Russia, such as the Caucasian Confederation in Russia that have used violence both against the state and against civilians, but also organizations that were engaged in kind of broader armed conflicts. You could think of Serbian or Croatian organizations participating in the Bosnian civil war, right?
So that's an interesting example because, that's partly a kind of national divide that happens to be defined in religious terms. So there's a kind of national identity that is caught up with religion there. So it's not necessarily religious ideas that are motivating violence. It may be that there's other aspects of identity that are just intertwined with religion in some cases.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? Because in this paper, we are indeed looking at a specific subset of political organizations. We're looking at ethno-political organizations. So these are political organizations, as I defined them before, that represent specific ethnic groups within a country. All right, that can be the Castilians and Catalans in Spain, can be the German versus Italian versus French speakers in Switzerland, can be African Americans or Caucasians or whites in the US, can be Shiites and Sunni in Iraq, right? So these are ethnic groups, and we're looking at political organizations that represent or claim to represent such ethnic groups within a given country. Now, we do that because if you think of, the kind of examples that people have in mind when they think of religion-based violence, many of these examples, such as the example of Hamas that I mentioned before, really falls into that category, right?
Yeah.
But, even beyond that, if there is something specific about religion and violence, as some scholars have actually claimed, and we're challenging this notion in our paper, right? But some scholars have claimed there's a special relationship between religion and violence. If that's the case, we should definitely find that same pattern among this important subset of ethno-political organizations, right? So, yes, the examples I mentioned are very much in that kind of subset of organizations.
And it's interesting what you were saying there about the existing literature. Do you want to say a bit more about what's in the existing literature that you're seeking to respond to in the paper that we're talking about?
So that's a very important point here, Alan, right? Because it's not only the scholarly literature, right? So there is this idea of religion and violence has become a very prominent one in the public mind, right? In the public debate, not least because of, because of it being voiced by certain intellectuals and politicians. But then there are also parts of the scholarly literature, perhaps going back to Samuel Huntington's famous idea of the clash of civilizations, right? There are parts of social science literature that make this kind of general argument about a special relationship between religion and violence. What does that mean? Well, basically, there's something about religion that makes it particularly prone to causing violence among human beings, right? And people have argued that religion is uniquely capable of removing human beings' moral constraints, or perhaps inspiring martyrdom in individuals, right? Fighting and dying in the name of God. Some people have argued that it makes compromises inherently more difficult. Of course, the example is always Jerusalem. How do you divide Jerusalem, right? So there is a part in the scholarly literature that has quite prominently kind of advanced this argument of religion having this unique force to cause violence. And we're challenging this. So we're taking issue with this idea on kind of two grounds, right? On the one hand, we say that these perspectives or these arguments often lack a historic perspective. Of course, I mentioned Huntington's influential thesis, Clash of Civilizations, before, but then the other watershed event that kind of shaped people's thinking was 9/11, of course, right? And then there was this whole terrorism literature that came out of that is also connected to the religion violence idea. But if you go back, for example, even focusing on the terrorism literature, if you go back and look at earlier contributions to this literature, it was always very clear that terrorism, which is a particular form of political violence, has been related to different kind of ideological forces over the course of history. You think of anti-colonial movements, some of which are engaged in violence, some of which even engage in violence against civilians, right? Leftist organizations did the same. And so religion is just kind of a new ideological force that can become related to violence in a particular historical period. So the idea that there would be something unique about religion and violence needs to be tested systematically across different periods in time and not just looking at the most recent kind of events, right? And the second point we were very unhappy about is, many of these studies, when they, talk about religion removing moral constraints in individuals or inspiring martyrdom, many of these studies, then they just focus on religious organizations and do not compare them to other organizations. You could think of nationalist organizations, and it seems obvious that a lot of nationalist organizations or ideas have inspired similar idea of martyrdom, the idea of fighting and dying in the name of the nation, right, or removing moral constraints from individuals. So what we really need to do is we need to compare organizations with religious agendas to other organizations with other types of agendas. And we also need to do that across different historical periods. And that's exactly what existing studies, we think, did not do sufficiently, right? And that's what really the contribution of our paper is. We have unique data that allow us to precisely do that.
Fascinating. And just before we get to the data, just to dig a little bit further into the theoretical framework that you have there. So one point that you've already mentioned there is the idea of these different periods in historical time where there's different ideas out there. And you refer to transnational ideology as these kind of forces of ideas that are out there during different periods that shape the degree to which different kinds of organization might be willing to use violence. So do you want to develop that a little bit further? And then I guess there's some other ideas that you have in the theoretical framework for the paper as well.
Yeah. So in the paper, we use the term zeitgeist, right, which happens to come from my own native language, right? And it basically means, it refers to this kind of like prevailing or dominant ideological spirit, right?
The spirit of the time.
Exactly. The literal translation would be a ghost. And then you could think of a ghost that is haunting a particular time, right? A particular historical period. So this is really a prevailing ideological or moral climate that affects individuals' thinking and individuals' behavior in a given period of time. Now, in this paper, we're obviously mostly concerned with the transnational zeitgeist with respect to political conflict, right? In what kind of ideas are political conflicts cast? In a period, especially following the Russian Revolution, and then in Latin America, for example, following the Cuban Revolution, right? In this kind of Cold War world where two different economic systems confront each other, a lot of political conflicts on the ground in different countries all across the world are just more likely to be cast in this kind of confrontation between economic systems and in class terms, right? And our argument in this paper is that in the late 20th century, a new kind of zeitgeist developed that was much more centered on religion and the idea of kind of religion or religious morality juxtaposed against the moral fallacies and the moral illegitimacy of secular/liberal governments that dominated all across the post-colonial world, right? So
why does that happen? Why should we expect to see that kind of shift?
Yeah, that's not necessarily something that we explore in the paper, right? But as a social scientist, broadly speaking, I would think that such new zeitgeists that are relevant to conflict develop as more and more people become unhappy with the status quo, and existing ideas are perhaps too close to power to serve as a new compass, right? So that people need a new kind of anti-status quo ideology that allows them to kind of embed their grievances and make sense of their grievances, explain why they are unhappy, and especially ideas that tell them how their grievances can be addressed, right?
So you have an increasingly secularizing status quo, an secularizing establishment during the 20th century, and then people are reacting to that in the late 20th century. Is that it?
I would think so. And I would think that, in many countries, especially in the post-colonial world, you would expect citizens to be somewhat discontented with the progress made after decolonization, but you could also think of, in the non-colonized world, citizens becoming increasingly uncomfortable with secular forms of government and attributing failures of government to a lack of moral guidelines in those who rule, right? So you're unhappy with your circumstances, you're unhappy with the system, what it does for you, and you're trying to kind of pinpoint the fallacies of the existing system. And towards the end of the 20th century, these fallacies all across the world became more and more seen in this secular versus religious terms, and the failures of governments being seen as the fallacies or the illegitimacy of secular government, right? And so how can you counter that? Well, you embrace religious morality and then advocate for a radical transformation of the current system into a new, more religiously proper government, right? And that develops over time, both the number of people who are unhappy and the degree of unhappiness, right? And at some point, such a new zeitgeist reaches a critical mass with enough followers who believe that this is really the issue and that's the way government needs to be transformed. And as, of course, the defenders of the status quo, those who rule, those who hold the power, as they resist attempts for reform, then increasingly this desire to transform the system leads to conviction that things can only be changed if there is a radical transformation. The system really needs to be revoked. A new system needs to be introduced that is based on new moral principles. And more often than not, and more often than before, these kind of new moral principles were related to religion in the late 20th century.
Great. That's really clear. Thank you. So we've got the part of the theoretical framework that you offer in opposition or in distinction to the idea that religion and violence are just inherently related. So you're arguing that in actual fact, or you're hypothesizing that in fact that relationship varies over time in response to the transnational zeitgeist, as you call it. But then you also argue in a kind of further layer of pointing out the contingency of the relationship between religion and violence. You argue that local factors, country-specific factors, are also going to make a difference here, which I guess again relates to what you've just been saying about the factors that lead to religion-based violence in the first place. You're suggesting that, well, the degree to which those factors play out in different countries shapes the degree of violence that we should expect to see.
Yeah, and 2 points here are really crucial, right? So this kind of trend that developed in the late 20th century really came to a culmination, if you will, with the 1979 Iranian Revolution, right? And I mentioned the Russian and Cuban Revolution before, right? The Iranian Revolution fulfilled a similar role for this new transnational zeitgeist that really propagated the role of religion in advancing an alternative political system. I mentioned before, parts of the scholarly literature really made this general argument about religion and violence, but other scholars already previously noted, that there are certain context conditions that shape the relationship between religion and violence. Now, what our paper does is integrate different existing arguments into a more kind of comprehensive picture, right? So people have mentioned that the Iranian Revolution brought about a change. Mm-hmm. People also looked at certain local conditions that shaped the relationship between religion and violence. Some people noted that religion becomes particularly relevant in self-determination conflicts. Others talked about political exclusion, right? Scholars have noted the contextual factors. What we do in this paper is we integrate them into one kind of comprehensive theoretical argument. At first, we're noting something really culminates in the 79 Iranian Revolution. So we would expect the relationship between religion and violence to change after 79 compared to before. But as in every other of these historical periods, not all organizations pertaining to a particular ideological strand will engage in violence. Why do some organizations do and others do not, even within the same historical period or transnational zeitgeist, right? And that's where these local conditions come into play. And we're looking at 3 different contextual factors. One is the relationship between the country and the Iranian Revolution. Given the avowedly open Islamic character of the Iranian Revolution, you would expect the revolution to have a more pronounced effect in countries that are closer to Iran. That's really what we find, right? We also find that countries where political corruption is ripe and countries where religious organizations are repressed, these are the countries where political organizations are more likely to engage in violence against the state post-79 than before.
Yeah. So we've set out the theory there, and you've hinted there that you find that indeed you do see this change from pre-1979 to post-1979, and that you see that variation in which organizations, religious organizations, in which countries are involved in these kinds of activities. We should say a bit about how you get those findings. So you mentioned earlier that you use this big data set in order to do this. Do you want to just describe that data set and what analysis you do?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the main advantages that our paper offers compared to previous literature. The data set we use, which I collected over various years, covers a large number of countries over a large stretch of time. More specifically, it's 40 countries for the time period between 1946, so immediately after the Second World War, until 2013. So there is a very broad geographic and temporal coverage that we can exploit in our study, which means we really have the means to test both the historical and the national level conditions that we theorize. But then the other advantage is that our dataset includes a very broad variety of organizations, not only violent organizations. That's a common mistake, that people just look at the most violent, most prominent cases of violence, right? And then they see the agenda of these organizations and then they come to wrong assumptions, right? When we test the relationship between religion and violence, we need to look at organizations that engage in violence, but also at organizations that do not engage in violence. And we need to look at organizations that make religious claims or have a religious agenda and organizations that do not have a religious agenda. We always need, so to speak, a control group, right? The counterfactual. And that's what our data offers, right? So we have about 700 organizations in 40 different countries over about 70 years of time, right? And our data set provides yearly codings of these organizations' political demands versus towards the government and their violent and non-violent actions. And then we can use statistical methods to probe the relationship between religion and violence by comparing organizations that make religious claims to those that do not. And we can even control for other demands that organizations might advance. In fact, one of our kind of side findings is, for example, that organizations that make self-determination claims are more likely to engage in violence, right? So our data set provides this opportunity to actually compare religions to others.
And you've already hinted at the findings. Do you want to just sum up what the overall findings from the paper are?
Yeah, so the key findings are organizations that make religious demands or have a religious agenda are more likely to use violence post-79 compared to before. If we look at the whole historical period, there is no systematic relationship between religion and violence, which really emphasizes this kind of historical dependency. This new transnational zeitgeist that came really to the fore with the Iranian Revolution had an influence on the relationship between religion and violence.
Before that period, religious organizations are less likely to engage in violence than non-religious organizations, I think, whereas after that switchover point, religious organizations become more likely to engage in violence.
If you look at the percentages of religious organizations that use violence, it really spikes just shortly after the 79 threshold. And in the whole period before, organizations that have no religious demands are actually more likely to engage in violence against the state.
I should let you get on to the but.
Exactly. But then this transnational zeitgeist is not uniform across contexts. And what we find here is really that in contexts where religious organizations are repressed, you can think of Egypt as an example, right? Not that, religion as such is repressed or was repressed by Mubarak and now Sisi, right? No, religion is really embraced by the regime. But what the regime does is it goes against independent religious organizations that could kind of come to incubate opposition. So they go against independent religious organizations, they repress such organizations. And that's exactly the kind of context where these religious organizations are more likely to engage in violence in this new historical period. And we also find that in countries with high levels of political corruption, this idea of the illegitimacy of secular government finds more fertile ground, right? Precisely where citizens know that their governments really do engage in corruption to a high degree, these citizens are more likely to embrace a religious alternative to the secular regime, and organizations then are more likely to use violence to try to overcome such corrupt regimes, right? So this really points to the importance of kind of more local contextual factors that they kind of determine whether the transnational zeitgeist resonates with actors on the ground.
And finally, then, what are the implications for policymakers? So presumably policymakers who want to counter religious violence, what should they do?
Yeah, one thing that I haven't mentioned so far is, why does this kind of new transnational zeitgeist that embraces religion as an alternative to secular government, why does that lead to violence? Well, on the one hand, it's, of course, it brings these actors who kind of advocate these ideas on a collision course with the power holders, with the defenders of status quo. And ultimately, this is likely to produce violence at some point, right? But it also has some sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy dynamic here, which is in this new transnational zeitgeist, governments are likely to see these actors that have a religious agenda as particularly dangerous. So what do governments do? Oftentimes they engage in preemptive repression against these organizations. And that is a recipe almost for violence.
So just dig a little bit further into that, because so you find in the paper that higher violence takes place where there is greater repression. So you're positing that repression leads to violence. A reader might be worried that actually it goes the other way around and that violence prompts repression, but you're clear that that is not what's happening.
Yes. So that's something that we tested, of course, this issue of reverse causality, and we have various robustness tests, focusing on countries only or organizations that never used violence before, using various statistical techniques as well, because that's an important, obvious concern. But we actually do also find that repression against religious organizations does increase after 79 compared to before. And that suggests that one reason why we see this change post versus pre-79 is that governments really became scared of organizations with religious agendas, even organizations that never used violence before. And so they engaged in preemptive repression out of fear that these were the troublemakers. And then this kind of preemptive repression becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy with these organizations then engaging in violence. So that brings us back to your question of the policy implications. And one key takeaway finding is really not to single out organizations based, or any kind of political actors based on their political agenda and subject them to particularly harsh treatment, right? So just because certain organizations advocate certain political agendas, state governments should not single these out for persecution, sanctions, repression more generally, because that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. An approach of discourse and focusing more on substantive questions that these organizations have in mind is a more promising approach. That's certainly one key policy lesson. And then, of course, when it comes to corruption, we know that corruption has a number of undesirable social consequences in general, right? Now, our study suggests that it's often in these contexts where citizens and organizations come to the point where they feel like violence is really the response, right? So anti-corruption initiatives have positive consequences in general, probably, but they also might have this kind of additional kind of benefit, right, of proving to citizens that existing governments actually do have legitimacy and are able to provide to ordinary people.
It's interesting because it kind of sounds like what you're saying is that in order to avoid religious violence, it's better to have an open society, an inclusive political discourse and political structure, and avoid corruption. And, we might kind of think, well, these are the things that you would expect to lead to a healthier political system in general, not just reduced religious violence. But I guess in a way that's kind of your point. There's nothing special about religion here. Religious violence is a manifestation of other problems in society that just happens during this historical epoch to be associated with religion. But actually the fundamental drivers are elsewhere in society.
Yes, exactly. And that's precisely what we would argue in this paper, right? That every historical period has its kind of ideological alternative to the status quo. And in the current historical period, although that might be changing now with current events, but up to now, after the Iranian Revolution, religion and religious ideologies have provided the material for people to imagine an alternative form of government, an alternative society. And the more problematic the situation is on the ground, the more likely people then are to embrace this alternative vision of the world, and the more likely they are to engage in violence to make this vision happen.
Well, thank you so much, Manuel. This has been a really great conversation on some of the most important dynamics in world politics, international politics over recent decades, and bringing real and important insight and policy implications as well that policymakers can really get their teeth into. So thank you for such an interesting conversation. We have been discussing the article, When Do Religious Organizations Resort to Violence? How Local Conditions Shape the Effects of Transnational Ideology, by Costantino Pisquera and Manuel Vogt, published in the latest issue of the journal Ethnopolitics. And as ever, we'll put details of that article in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we'll be exploring another very topical issue, namely the role of AI and data science in delivering public services. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.